Hi everyone, and welcome to this week's episode of Recovery Talk. So today I want to talk a bit about how an eating disorder affects the body and in terms of your lab results when you're doing blood samples. I'll discuss a bit more what certain things mean and what it doesn't mean, and also want to talk about having normal blood samples when you have an eating disorder and how this does not necessarily mean that you don't have a problem and that you are physically healthy. I also want to talk a bit more about some of the more surprising findings that you might find in someone with an eating disorder, such as high cholesterol and anorexia nervosa. Before getting started, I want to say a shout out to everyone who's found their way to my Substack and subscribed. That is very exciting. I've really been enjoying writing and I hope you guys are enjoying it. I've also launched a bonus podcast episode for the paying subscribers, which I'm covering my experience with rapid weight gain in early eating disorder recovery and this eventually evening out and my metabolism increasing. For people on the free subscriber tier, I also have plenty of open articles, such as about overwhelm in recovery. I just posted one about ethical orthorexia as well. And there is much more to come. So I hope you guys are enjoying my Substack as well. It's a little bit like Recovery Talk, just in written form. My Substack is letsrecover.substack.com. I'll also add a link in the episode description of this episode. And you can also just access it through my website, letsrecover.co.uk, and just click on articles via Substack. Anyways, guys, let's get started. So I want to start by saying something very, very, very important. And that is that in a lot of people with eating disorders, they will be very unwell, yet their blood samples will come up completely normal and so-called healthy. Our bodies have this incredible capability to try so hard to withstand extreme stress and famine. So your body can be very starved and stressed and actually not in a physically healthy state, yet it heavily compensates in order to keep you alive. You having normal blood samples does not mean your body is necessarily healthy or that your eating disorder is not causing any physical damage. If anything, this is a very, very normal thing with people with eating disorders, having normal or at least relatively normal blood samples. But this does not mean that there aren't damage being done, nor that there aren't any consequences of this damage. It just means that our bodies are very, very good at camouflaging certain issues. It also is very, very individual what kind of, if someone has some blood samples being off, what is off, right? Different bodies work differently. This is something that I discussed in a previous episode where I talk about periods, right? How or for those who menstruate, some people will lose their period pretty fast from an eating disorder, whilst other people can have their period even on their deathbed, right? That is not necessarily always a signifier of just how ill you are, right? It's more about what your body prioritizes. So you can see someone having a lot of signs of starvation, but for example, they have perfectly healthy hair and they don't have significant hair loss, right? But they have other kind of symptoms of starvation. Or someone can be deathly ill, but they still have their period. And I'm saying this because an eating disorder is essentially the master gaslighter. An eating disorder will constantly tell you, oh, I'm not really here. You're just making me up. You don't have a problem. And it does so whilst at the same time it is completely controlling your life. And of course, then you may be finally gathering the courage to go to your GP and confess, hey, I have a problem. And then the GP is like, sure, let's also do your blood samples. And then your blood samples come up normal and you're thinking, well, this just shows I don't have a problem. I can just continue doing this. So normal blood samples does not mean that you are doing well, okay? Then again, in some people, there are certain findings that will occasionally happen. I'm just going to go through a few of them. This will not be all, and this will also just be a very, it won't be like very much of an in-depth explanation, but just more of an overview. So first of all, some people with eating disorders may have certain nutritional deficiencies. For example, low iron is a very typical one. This one is especially common in people who don't consume enough meat. For example, vegetarians or vegans, but then again, not all vegetarians or vegans, right? Because there still, of course, are iron sources outside of meat. It's more just that meat and overall animal products are a better source because it's easier for the body to absorb Therefore, people who are vegetarian or vegan are more prone to iron deficiency, whether you have an eating disorder or not. Then again, abnormally heavy menstrual bleedings can also trigger an iron deficiency in some people. Other common vitamin deficiencies will be vitamin D. Then again, this one is also very, very common in people without eating disorders. So now just to start, I'm going through some deficiencies that are common in the mainstream population. It's more that undernourishment can make you a bit more prone to it. So one very seemingly paradoxical finding that is done, especially in some people with anorexia, is high cholesterol levels. This one can be so confusing and triggering because in general, when someone has high cholesterol, what the GP tends to say is, oh, you should eat less foods with high cholesterol. And these are often foods high in fats, right? So for the person with an eating disorder who very often will already be avoiding these foods like the plague, hearing that can just kind of reinforce the fear. But here's the truth. High cholesterol in someone who's actually severely restricting is very different from so-called normal high cholesterol. High cholesterol in this context will actually be a side effect of restriction. I was investigating this topic and honestly, they seem to not be 100% sure as to why. There were a lot of different explanations I found, a lot of different theories, but overall what they say is that this is a normal response to starvation. It's a result of the starvation itself, and it will normalize with consistent recovery and staying recovered. Any kind of efforts on further restriction and cutting out certain foods is not going to help. Don't let your eating disorder try and trick you into this showing proof that, quote unquote, certain foods are bad or that you need to restrict. And it's very unfortunate because sometimes eating disorders aren't always identified and not all doctors have adequate knowledge on how an eating disorder may manifest. So they might see high cholesterol in the patient and just by default be like, oh yeah, eat less cholesterol, not knowing that their patient may already be restricting this. Another finding that is found in some, but can be very triggering and misinterpreted, is low thyroid hormone. In people with eating disorders, this would be different from typical, like having a hypothyroid disorder, like for example, Hashimoto's. That would be a different thing. But of course, the eating disorder can twist and turn, and you might misunderstand and assume, well, my thyroid is low, that means low metabolism, means I can never recover, no. So another consequence of restriction, significant restriction, the body starts kind of eating itself. I know that sounds really brutal, but that is essentially what happens. This can manifest in shrunken heart and a very slow heart rate, which can be very triggering because the person with an eating disorder may think that, oh, my heart rate is low, therefore I'm just very fit. Oh, I'm in good shape from all the compulsive movement, right? So we know that an eating disorder tends to create muscle loss, and your heart is a muscle, right? So essentially your heart is being eaten by itself. I know that sounds really brutal, but that is unfortunately what can happen. And the same can go with your liver. So some people may have elevated liver enzymes, which is actually a sign of your liver being severely struggling. What is a bit confusing and can also be kind of triggering is that sometimes when someone starts recovery, certain blood works maybe even get worse for a bit, such as the liver enzymes, right? Essentially, I often say that in recovery, things may get worse before better. This is not a sign that recovery is not working. It's a sign that your body is responding to having been severely starved and now adjusting to the increased intake. I want to remind you, if you are in the risk group of refeeding syndrome, it's very, very important that you have medical supervision when you are increasing your intake in early recovery. So another common finding, which is not necessarily found on, a blood sample, is low bone density. This would be found on a DEXA scan, aka bone density scan. You'll realize that your bone density is lower than normal. Then again, this is also individual, vary from person to person. Not everyone gets it, but this is a very typical sneaky sign that many people kind of ignore. Essentially what this means is your bones become more fragile and they deteriorate a lot earlier than they should. For example, during my eating disorder, I did a scan and my bones were essentially in a range that's more normal for an elder lady rather than a young lady like me. Thankfully, this can be restored and fixed, but that takes refeeding, it takes rest, it takes restoration of weight. And if you're someone who menstruates, it means you have to restore your menstrual cycles as well. A lot of times people don't realize that the restoration of menstrual cycles is necessary when it comes to repair of their bone density. And they may think, oh yeah, but I'm eating more, maybe put on some weight. So, I still don't have my period, but my bones should be completely fine now. But actually, you need to restore your cycles if you lost your period. Yes, you can take certain supplements like calcium, like vitamin D, but it won't be sufficient if you have lost your period. And when it comes to being so-called weight restored and eating a so-called sufficient intake but still not having a period, what's a very important thing is that you also look at your rest levels, right? A lot of people need complete rest in order to restore their periods. It's also important to consume adequate amounts of fats, especially animal sources. So dairy, ice cream, all of these are really, really good sources for getting your period back. Getting your period back may be something that takes a bit of time, but if months and months and months go by and nothing happens, it could be worth investigating. Are you really covering all of the so-called R's that I mentioned? So resting sufficiently, restoration of weight to your natural set point weight range, refeeding, properly eating a sufficient amount of calories and also sufficient amount of fats. So yeah, these are important ones to investigate. And last one that I want to mention is potassium. So especially in some people who are purging or maybe abusing laxatives, potassium can be low, and this is very, very, very dangerous. It can literally lead to your heart stopping. So for a lot of people with eating disorders, they have this excessive loss of fluids and salts and electrolytes like potassium. And this can make you feel weak, tired, crampy, notice abnormal heart rhythm. If you notice these things, especially if you've just purged or you've just been abusing laxatives, it's very important that you seek medical care because this can be quite dangerous. The solution here would of course be to stop the compensatory behavior that create this fluid loss that then creates this loss of potassium and sodium and just overall electrolyte disturbances. So this is a finding that's more common in people with bulimia. Then again, not everyone with bulimia will have this particular finding. So don't think that just because your potassium is fine, now you can just continue purging. That is not what this means. And also, things such as potassium levels will tend to vary from day to day. Your potassium levels may be acutely low after purging, but then if you have a few days without it, then go to the GP and get your bloods drawn. You might have a different results. Another thing that I would like to mention here is I see a bit of a pattern with people with eating disorders who would drink insane amounts of water and consume very little salt. This can also be a bit unfortunate because you're essentially flushing out very important electrolytes. So make sure you're getting enough salt. And I would also tend to recommend, instead of just chugging liter upon liter of water, recovery is a very good time to focus on energy-dense drinks instead. Also, if you are someone drinking tons and tons of water, it might also be worth investigating if you're trying to suppress hunger. Again, this is what I'm saying. Drink things with energy in them. Whether that is smoothies, chocolate milk, hot chocolates, juices, whatsoever. And it's especially important if your eating disorder is really resistant towards it. So I did briefly mention that sometimes during refeeding, certain things on the blood sample might seem to get a bit worse before it gets better, and this can of course be very confusing. And the cholesterol is another one, right? Sometimes people may notice that the cholesterol is high in eating disorder recovery and then immediately jump to the conclusion that, well, this just proves that recovery is not good. Recovery is not good for me. Oh my goodness, I can't eat XYZ. And this is why I believe it's so important to work with a doctor that has knowledge of eating disorders and how it affects the body physically. And also how it affects you mentally. Because sometimes doctors know a lot about what's going on physically, but they really don't know what to say and what not to say. There are also plenty of other physical symptoms that may occur in recovery that can be a little bit confusing. And I have covered a lot of these more in depth in previous episodes. And I will also talk more about them on my Substack in near future. But for example, night sweats, that's a very, very common one. You wake up and you're feeling all sweaty, or you maybe have hot flushes during the day. This is very common, and it is related to your metabolism increasing, and also your hormones are going through it, right? It can sometimes feel a bit like a second puberty or in my case, I actually felt like I was going through early menopause, because I remember having to sit by windows because I was so hot and I would get these random hot flashes. And I was like, oh my goodness, why is this happening? Am I not too young for menopause? It was just recovery. Hormones sorting themselves out, my metabolism rising, all of these things. Another common thing in recovery is that your weight gain, especially that initial weight gain, will in many cases tend to seem a bit disproportionate and stay more in the abdominal area. Of course, some of this is literally just bloating and water retention, which we know tends to love sticking in the abdominal area. And a lot of it also is body dysmorphia. So you may see this and blow it out of proportions and think that, oh my goodness, all my weight gain has gone to my stomach. My stomach is so massive, when actually it's not really that significant. But there is tendency to gain a little bit more weight in the abdominal area just to protect internal organs in the early stages of recovery. And then as you keep going, no restriction, no panicking the body and telling the body, oh, famine is still ongoing, you'll notice that eventually it starts evening out. And I know these things can be scary. And I think sometimes certain practitioners, they don't want to tell these things to their clients. For example, that some of the weight gain may feel like it goes more to the stomach in the beginning, or that weight gain may be quick in the beginning and then slow down, just because they're scared it would put people off recovery. But here's the thing. I actually find that by making this very clear, people are prepared. So when it happens to them, they don't panic and relapse. They actually are like, oh yeah, this is a normal part of the process, and it helps them keep going. Because if people don't know about these things, they may panic and think there is something wrong with them, or that recovery is not working, and see, my eating disorder was right all along, rather than being informed that it is a temporary phase of recovery and that it actually is the eating disorder's fault, not recovery's fault. Because again, recovery in your body is just responding to the damage that has been done from the starvation of the eating disorder. Okay guys, I hope you enjoyed this episode, quite briefly going through some of the physical complications of eating disorders and some of the results that some people see in their labs. These were of course just some examples. There is a lot more going on, but I just wanted to touch upon a few that often comes up. And like I said again, you may be physically appear completely healthy on a blood sample, but this does not mean that you necessarily are. So be mindful of that. So now I'm going to take a listener question. And the listener question goes, does your exercise advice still apply for elite athletes? And my answer to that is yes. My advice of the importance of working on your relationship with exercise, embracing rest and recovery, restoring your period if you're someone who normally menstruates and have lost your period, it applies to everyone, whether they are completely sedentary or go for the occasional eating disorder walk, or if they are someone who is a professional athlete. Your body is not going to be like, oh, I mean, you really physically need rest, but you're an elite athlete, so it's okay. I won't cause any damage. That's not how it works. If you are an elite athlete, it's even more important to have a team around you that understand these complexities. I'll use an example of this. So in my home country of Norway, skiing is a very, very popular sport, and anything related to skiing. So ski jumping, I think that's what it's called at least, cross-country skiing, just any kind of winter sports is very big in Norway, and the athletes are actually often become quite famous. And unfortunately, especially in cross-country skiing and in the jumping, where you basically jump from like a slope, I truly do not know if there is a better word for this. Anyways, I hope you guys know what I mean. There is a bit of a problem with eating disorders. And of course, yes, there have been some criticism towards the trainers and how they are actually dealing with this. But overall, there tends to be a health check for the athletes to see if they're getting enough food, if they're physically prepared. And for the female athletes, are they having their periods? And if someone is being identified as not being in the right place for participating, then they will be on a break to work on their health. So very often there will be athletes who don't meet the health criteria to compete for the season. So very often people who are either athletes, elite athletes, or just very, very passionate about a certain sport, they think that it wouldn't apply to them because they enjoy doing it and they don't necessarily do it for exclusively disordered reasons. But here's the thing, it still applies. And if anything, if you really enjoy a specific type of activity, or even if you may rely your future income on it, wouldn't that make it extremely important to work on that exercise so that you can do it mentally and physically safe? because the alternative would essentially be a very early retirement from some kind of physical injury or just from realizing that you cannot do this anymore, right? So it's not sustainable. So overall, you being an elite athlete does not mean that you suddenly get a what is it called? Get out of jail free card in terms of working on your relationship with exercise. If anything, it just makes it very, very important to do so. Make sure you have a good team around you that can help you with your recovery, whether that is a coach or trainer in terms of your sport, a doctor that monitor you. Make sure you have that team. And if you are an elite athlete, then you very often will have this added benefit of having some of that follow-up in the team around you, right? Just because you enjoy a certain movement does not mean that that magically makes up for any kind of physical damage that movement might create, or any kind of mental damage. Whether you are an elite athlete or someone who just really enjoys swimming, it does not matter. You still need to address these kind of things in your relationship with exercise in order to get a mentally and physically healthier outcome. Also, any kind of movement is just a lot more enjoyable when the eating disorder is not involved. So take that as an added benefit as well. Okay guys, I hope this helps and I hope you enjoy this episode.